It's the biggest question the Bengals have faced in years. What do you do with Tee Higgins? There's three doors the front office can take. First, they could extend him. They could keep the trio of Ja'Marr Chase, Joe Burrow, and Tee Higgins together, continue to let that group pursue a championship. They could trade him, free up some cash right now, get some young, valuable draft picks back in return, reconfigure the core, and go after it again in 2024. Or they could simply tag him and push off the decision another year, decide what to do with Higgins in 2025. Now, the Tee Higgins dilemma is the definition of a first world problem in the NFL. It's like saying we only have enough money to redo the kitchen or the bathroom this fall, or we can only travel to Hawaii or the Alps this winter. But that being said, how Cincinnati decides to handle this decision will have major ramifications in their pursuit of their first Super Bowl. If the Bengals do choose to extend Higgins, no one in the NFL will bat an eye. It's clearly become a weapons league, and very few teams can match the pairing of Ja'Marr Chase and Tee Higgins. The 6'4" behemoth receiver has produced as soon as he walked into the NFL. He has two 1,000-yard seasons under his belt, and he's always done well in Sumer Sports' adjusted yards per out run metric, which essentially says he's efficient. On top of that, his presence alone creates mismatches. He towers over smaller corners and allows Ja'Marr Chase to move all over the formation. Retaining Higgins also keeps consistency among Joe Burrow's pass catchers. If Higgins were to be traded, Cincinnati would have to find replacements for him, and it would take time for those new players to build chemistry with their quarterback. Extending Higgins also prevents Director of Player Personnel Duke Tobin from making one of the biggest mistakes you can make in any professional sport, and that's giving great money to an okay player. Higgins is a known producer, so in a vacuum, giving him an extension makes a lot of sense. But like anything in life, there's trade-offs with every decision. The unique dilemma facing Cincinnati is that they found their franchise quarterback and two stud receivers in back-to-back drafts, meaning all three will need extensions within quick succession of one another. So if Tee Higgins signs the extension that Brad Spielberger of PFF projected for him last year of 4 years, $97 million, that's nearly 1/3 of the Bengals' cash budget tied up in those three players. And that's just an enormous amount of money put into those three. Add in the fact that the Bengals already gave left tackle Orlando Brown Jr. a huge contract last offseason to be their franchise left tackle, and you now have 4 huge contracts in quick succession, all on the offensive side of the ball. You can do it, but there's major trade-offs with this. Now, it's rare to see a team pay a franchise quarterback and 2 high-end pass catchers at the same time. Now, some of that is because so few teams have the opportunity to do so, but on the other side of that coin, it really limits the general manager on how he's going to fill out the running back room, the offensive line, and the entire defensive side of the ball. So if the Bengals go this route of extending Higgins, they're going to need to save some of their budget for some big contracts on the defensive side of the ball and get ready to spend a good number of their upcoming first and second round picks over the next couple of drafts on defense so they can infuse that side of the ball with some young high-end talent. Because at the end of the day, if the Bengals do want to win a Super Bowl, they can't have a defense that's incapable of supporting what should be a very high-powered offense. Cincinnati and Duke Tobin reportedly had difficulties last summer when they entered contract negotiations with Higgins' camp, and they might decide this is the perfect time to move off of their number 2 receiver. With a lot of big-name receivers being moved in recent years, we know exactly what kind of package the Bengals should be asking for in return. Stephon Diggs, who is admittedly a better player, but was a similar age to Higgins when traded, got the Vikings the 22nd overall pick in the draft, as well as a 4th, 5th, and 6th when he was traded to the Bills. A.J. Brown was moved for the 18th overall pick as well as a 3rd round pick when he was moved from the Titans to the Eagles a couple of years ago. Then we have Brandon Cooks, who was moved twice for 1st round picks over 2 years. He was first moved for the 32nd overall pick in the draft from the Saints to the Patriots, as well as a 3-4 swap that favored New Orleans. Then when Cooks was moved the second time, New England traded him to the Rams for the 23rd overall pick in the draft, as well as a 4th-6th swap that favored Los Angeles. Lastly, we have Marquise Brown, who was traded from the Ravens to a Cardinals for a late 1st round pick, as well as a 3-4 swap that favored Arizona. Higgins falls right into the middle of that group I just listed from a talent perspective, so it's safe to say that his value in a trade would be roughly that of a late 1st round pick. What would help the Bengals if they do decide to move off of Higgins is there's clearly a massive thirst for pass catchers across the NFL. Nothing showed this better than the 2022 draft, where 6 NFL receivers were taken within the top 18 picks of the draft. So essentially, if the Bengals do decide to shop Higgins, there's going to be plenty of suitors. I mean, at least a third of the league needs receiver help, but there would be real barriers to a trade getting done. First off, the Bengals aren't dumb. They're not just going to trade the receiver to one of their biggest competitors in the AFC. So that means both the Chiefs and the Bills are off the table. Then when you look at a lot of the other really receiver-needy teams in the NFL, they already have top 10 picks in this upcoming draft, and that's above what Higgins is worth in a trade. So that means if those teams were to make a trade pitch for Higgins, the package would likely center around either a 2025 first or more likely day 2 picks starting in 2024. And I'm not sure if that's enough to entice the Bengals. So if the Bengals were set on getting a 2024 first round pick in a trade, some of their most likely trade partners would be either the Denver Broncos or the New Orleans Saints. An outside possibility would be the Houston Texans. Again, this is another up-and-coming AFC foe, so I'm not super sure that the Bengals would really want to make this trade. But it's possible the Texans would want to pair Higgins with Nico Collins and Tank Dell and just full send it. And if they overpaid, there's a chance the Bengals could go for it. We know there will be no shortage of demand if Higgins is put on the trade block, but it's really a matter of, are the Bengals open to getting a non-traditional trade package back? Would they look at just getting a player in return? Would they look at a combination of 2024 day 2 picks mixed in with some 2025 day 2 picks? Would they want a 2025 first because it creates more variability in where that pick would land, as long as it was paired with a round 3 or round 4 2024 pick? It really depends on that, because if they really want a trade package similar to what all the other teams in recent years have received, I'm not sure an obvious partner is there for them. Now, the leading belief amongst most analysts is that the Bengals are simply going to tag Higgins, because the two sides reportedly really never got close to an extension last year, and considering they lost their chance to compete for a Super Bowl in 2023 once Joe Burrow got hurt, I think it would, at least on a surface level, be understandable if the side said, hey, we're just going to run it back. We're just going to try to win one in 2024. We'll figure out this problem next year. Now, there are risks to going down this path. If the Bengals tag Higgins, it's really manageable for 2024. It's $22 million fully guaranteed, but it would put them in an awkward position in 2025. So they could tag Higgins again, but it's going to be a minimum 20% increase on his salary. So now they're looking at $26 million fully guaranteed, which would give Higgins more leverage in contract negotiations. And then if the Bengals have said, hey, next year, now we're going to try and trade you, well, there's a good chance that the package that they would receive back would not be quite as strong as the ones they passed up this year. So it can be a little bit of a tenuous situation if they just purely say, hey, we're just going to figure this out next year. The other thing is, Higgins could suffer a massive injury. I don't know if I would be basing my decision off of that, but we are talking about a player who's had multiple hamstring pulls, an ankle sprain, a concussion, and a rib fracture already in his young career. So if you're looking for a comparison of how other teams in similar situations have handled this dilemma, you really don't have to look far. This is the exact scenario that led to the Tyreek Hill trade from the Chiefs to the Dolphins. The Chiefs GM Brett Veach looked around and saw how hard it was going to be to pay Patrick Mahomes, Travis Kelce, and Tyreek Hill all extremely high salaries at their position and said, you know what? Now's the time. We're going to send Hill to the Dolphins, get a first and second round pick, and reload our team with some youth and some cheap talent. So despite the fact that Tyreek Hill is clearly a generational talent and a perfect fit with Patrick Mahomes, Brett Veach zoomed out and saw the bigger picture and said, now's the time. The next year, the Chiefs won the Super Bowl. Now, on the downside, we have seen how hard it's been for the Chiefs to find complementary receiving threats since trading Hill to surround Travis Kelce with some help, but it's hard to argue with their results. This Tee Higgins decision facing the Bengals is the biggest one since the Jamar Chase Penei Sewell debate of a few years ago. And I think when you look at their options, the best decision would just be to extend Higgins. It's a weapons league. You need more than one guy to catch the ball. We saw what happened to the Packers when they had Aaron Rodgers in his peak and Devontae Adams in his peak. They kept running into the top teams in the NFC and they couldn't get through them. Rodgers needed complementary receiving threats. That's part of why he got so mad at the end of his career there. So, even though it's a ton of their cash budget, you're putting it into the most valuable part of the sport. which is having a high-end passing offense. And I think if you were to move off of Higgins, you'd want to wait a few years. You'd want to wait till he was closer to that 27, 28-year-old threshold where you could trade him and the receiving team would talk themselves into getting 2 to 3 or even 4 years out of the player, so you could still get a really strong return back. But how the Bengals decide to handle this will go a long way in determining their future and if they really are going to win their first Super Bowl.